Hey guys, Yankee Jeff, it's not your fault. Part 3 of 3 about my review and the interview with the author of Tell Your Children the Truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence and its effects it has on people. And this is Alex Berenson with a Q&A session at the end of his interview talking about the book and about some of the things that we've talked about in the past about marijuana. It is addictive. It can lead to death in some cases. And he's going to wrap up here with some more Q&A. Got another 15 minutes or so, give or take. So let's get back into it. Please like and subscribe, and I'll leave a comment at the very end. This is part 3 of 3 with the interview with Alex Berenson.
You know, dog's arthritis is what their kid is upstairs smoking every morning. And that, you know, that's yet another terrible thing that the industry has done, is to promote this confusion. So, you know, sometimes I feel like I am just so busy trying to get out basic truths that, you know, to argue any of the more complicated stuff is next to impossible.
Down here in front. There'll be somebody brings you a microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm Bob Dupont, and I'm just proud to be here and appreciate the presentation. I want to bring up one thing. Marijuana is a long-term issue, but you'll notice it's changed its name to cannabis. And there's a reason for that, to get away from the hippie background, and it's become commercialized in a way that was unfathomable, unbelievable. And I think the commercialization has changed the whole game in a very profound way. And what we've seen in past of these debates is nothing compared to where we're going to go. And you also mentioned about the liberal. There's quite a large conservative group of people who are supporting legalization of marijuana too. But I particularly want to ask you to think about that speak about that commercialization, which is Altria just invested $15 billion in marijuana and vaping.
Yes.
That's changing the game.
So interesting, because I was talking to a friend of mine who's an investor a few days ago, and he said, you always you talk about the sort of the policy aspect of this, and you forget about the money, and you shouldn't forget about the money. And you're right, Bob, and he's right. The money does make a difference, and I think this has been led by policy, by wonks and think tanks. But the fact that people now have skin in the game is going to make it even harder and make the lies even bigger. And they're going to find researchers who will, either for ideological reasons or just for money, will spout their line. I mean, that's what tobacco did. We know it. It went on and on and on. And it's one reason why it took 40 years after scientists really started to coalesce around the idea that tobacco is dangerous for us as a society to reach that consensus. So I think you're right. Again, it's like I can only find so many people at once, but you're right.
Woman down in front. There'll be somebody bringing you a microphone.
Yes, I'm Paula Gordon. Nice to meet you and nice to see you here. Thank you for your comments. I have a website called GordonDrugAbusePrevention.com, and I'm also an educator and teach online courses for Auburn University outreach on marijuana and on the drug crisis. My question, it has to do with the so-called priming of the brain, or the sensitization of the brain to marijuana. And this has been shown, amongst other research, to occur, both animal and human research, to occur in the brains of fetuses who have been exposed in utero to marijuana, both animal fetuses and fetuses that have been aborted or have been miscarried. And there have been control groups of this too. And this carries on through adolescence, evidently. And I wonder if you're going to be including something like that. I only listened to your book in its audio form, but I didn't hear that mentioned.
So, so I think the science is emerging around this. And, I wanted to stick to places where the science was really strong. I do think this early data from the ABCD study is certainly concerning. My bigger issue around cannabis and parenting is what I like to call promotion of cannabis impaired parenting. by the by the Washington Post first and foremost, which in the last 5 months has written 3 stories by people, or published 3 articles, op-eds or opinion perspective pieces by people claiming that cannabis makes them better parents. Given, I mean, I realize that people sometimes talk about wine o'clock and Chardonnay mommies or whatever, but there's always a little bit, at least, of shame around this, which is not unreasonable, because I'm the parent of 2 young kids, and listen, I don't think that alcohol makes me a better parent, and I don't think that cannabis would make me a better parent, but it's actually much worse than that. There's very good statistical evidence from. There are 3 states that I know of, at least, there may be more, but there are at least 3 large states that do very good studies on the drug use by the caregivers or parents of children who've died from abuse or neglect. Every state is supposed to do this. Not every state does it very well. Texas, Florida, and Arizona do it well. And those 3 states show that cannabis use, or at the time of, or a history of cannabis abuse, is by far the most common drug that the parents or caregivers of these abused children, these children who died from abuse or neglect, are using. About 1/3, somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of child deaths occur at the hands of parents who are using or have a history of abuse of cannabis. That is more than any other drug by far, more than alcohol. It's way more than the use of cannabis in the population, even by groups that are likely to be, hurting their, younger, more marginalized populations. There is no way around the fact that cannabis use pops up in a large fraction of child deaths. And for the Washington Post to encourage the use of cannabis by the parents of young children is, I'm not going to say it's a crime, but it is a journalistic crime. And, I've done everything possible on my Twitter feed to call them on it, but, they prefer to ignore me.
Okay. Down in front here, they'll bring you a microphone. Just hold on.
Thanks. I'm a healthcare reporter with Modern Healthcare, and I did a story in October on looking at maternal use of marijuana. And what I found was a huge disconnect between it within the medical community over this, where it's the OBGYNs, the pediatricians really, raising
don't like it,
arm
yeah.
on it.
Yeah.
And then they're saying that there's kind of a suppression of research that they want to do. Can you talk a little more about where the medical community plays in? Because they seem to also play into on the policy side. They're not really calling out state legislatures to address the public health implications.
Sure. So the pediatricians have been a little bit more aggressive. The AMA has, really not said anything. It's said very little. The APA, the American Psychiatric Association, my wife is a psychiatrist. They just don't want to get involved, and they're going to have to, because their members are going to see too many cases of psychosis for them not to get involved at some point. Why the medical bodies have not been more aggressive, I don't know. People still do respect and listen to doctors. I can just tell you firsthand, if you speak up about this, you are vilified. And it becomes, for me, it's an all-consuming issue right now. Now, I have a book that, so in some ways I have to defend myself and my book. But if you're an MD, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, you have patients to take care of. You have clinical responsibilities. You have journals to read. You have an office to run and, insurers to fight with. You can't spend all your time getting yelled at by people in the cannabis lobby. And those people, they haven't been willing to stick up, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. Well, I'm going to fight right back, but I get why they don't want to be in this. But they're going to have to. And I hope they do, and the sooner the better.
Fellow in the back.
Hello, I'm Michael Sheminar. I'm a research assistant at the Cato Institute. We had an event on harm reduction about a month back, and one of the speakers was Adrienne Wilson-Poe, and she presented on research that seemed to show that cannabis and opioids could act as complements in pain reduction, so perhaps they don't work. Perhaps opioids are much more effective relative to cannabis, but it might allow to give smaller doses of opioids and therefore help possibly prevent dependence. So have you looked into this at all?
I don't know the study that she presented, but I can tell you there's beyond the fact that cannabis doesn't seem to be effective on its own, and beyond the fact that this large Australian study from last year showed that people who used cannabis wound up having higher use of opioids. And this was a 4-year study of more than 1,000 people. It was a pretty good study. There's a study from that JAMA Psychiatry, I think, published it early in 2018 showing that people who used cannabis were 3 times as likely to be using opioids 3 years later. The real world evidence on this is that if you give people an addictive recreational drug or encourage them to use an addictive recreational drug, they wind up using other addictive recreational drugs. I don't understand why that would be confusing to people, and especially since cannabis doesn't really work as a painkiller. So I don't think there's very good evidence, although I have to acknowledge I have not seen that data that she presented. Oh, Kevin Sabet has a...
I think it's important also to note the difference between being numb, feeling numb, and having no pain and being a painkiller. Having a glass of Chardonnay or Merlot kind of makes you feel numb, but it's not going to cure your back pain or make your back pain go away for a long term. It might, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, an hour. It's the same with marijuana. You can smoke and get relief from your pain temporarily because you're numb. And that's why he's trying to make that point. That's the 2 different things.
Yeah.
Quickly, Kevin Sabet, president of SAM. So it's a great question. And actually last week, the Journal of Addiction Medicine just published a study showing that it was looking at that exact question of complements and does it help together. And it said that, and I'm reading from the article, sufferers from chronic pain who use marijuana in conjunction with prescription opioids demonstrated higher instances of mental health issues and further substance use problems than those who used opioids alone. They controlled for multiple things, and then they found that instances of depression, anxiety, as well as opioid addiction, alcohol and cocaine use were higher in patients who used both drugs. Additionally, there was no reported difference in pain for either group.
And I think that's a naturalistic study, right? In other words, they just looked at a group of people. So again, that's not going to be quite as strong as, it's certainly not as strong as a randomized control trial, but it's not, it's not as strong necessarily as looking at a group of people over a course of a couple of years, but it's more evidence of this. And by the way, the best evidence of this is in the biggest uncontrolled study of all, which is in the United States and Canada, which are the 2 countries that have the most cannabis use in the West by far and have the worst opioid epidemics by far. And that even goes to, British Columbia, on a provincial basis in Canada. BC has a terrible problem with opioids and opioid deaths, and it has the most aggressive community of cannabis users, maybe anywhere in the world, maybe Colorado, San Francisco, BC. In the real world, getting people to use cannabis has not gotten them away from opioids.
Woman in green.
Hi, thanks. I'm Lisbeth Portman from the Addiction Policy Forum. One of the most powerful parts of your book was you walking us through the shift in your own thinking about this drug, and that you kind of credit to a story from someone you trust, aka your wife's lived experience, followed by inarguable evidence. And given what you call like the shock of the past 3 months, and of not being able to have a platform in these kind of powerful news outlets, what does that kind of transition from story to evidence and your surprise lead you to believe about actually changing people's minds and what we need in terms of storytelling right now?
So that's a great question. I think, so cannabis legalization, one of the great, the great planks that legalizers used was the stories of the parents of kids, young kids with epilepsy, who supposedly, or in some cases actually had gotten relief from THC or CBD. Again, eliding the difference between the two. When the mothers and fathers of adult children who were in college, had successfully graduated high school and were working, and then lost their minds and in some cases their lives to the psychosis that cannabis can produce. When those people start speaking loudly, there will be a change. When the medical society starts saying, this is real, we are seeing this, there will be a change. The media is going to have to I mean, I say they're going to have to, meaning both they should, and it will only happen if they broadcast those voices. But I would like to believe that my colleagues are not so far gone that they will not listen to the lived experiences of people who have, who have suffered themselves or whose families have been racked by this, even if they don't want to listen to me. But it's going to be a while, I think. If you're a betting person, you're going to bet that cannabis becomes legal in this country. Certainly, if there's a Democrat elected in 2020, there's great likelihood of full national legalization. And then there's going to be a large, powerful, well-financed group of people who are going to do everything possible to make it hard to hear these stories or to put them in context. But it will happen one person at a time. And the more parents, and by the way, this is hard, right? It's hard, especially if your child is still alive, right? If your child is 30 and on the streets somewhere and you're still hoping against hope that, he or she is going to come back from this. And so in some ways, it's going to be the parents of children who've died who are going to be the loudest voices. The science is incontrovertible. We can argue about risk ratios and we can argue about who's vulnerable here and how vulnerable. But there is too much evidence now of harm for it to be, it's not going to go away. So it's just a question of how long it takes and how willing the media is to listen to the reality.
We have an opportunity maybe for one more question. Sir, check shirt.
My name's Mike. Is there a correlation between the user's psychosis if the parent has schizophrenia?
Yeah, so you're clearly at higher risk for schizophrenia if you have a parent or a close family member, and that risk translates into a higher risk if you're using cannabis. You have the higher base risk, and so you have a higher multiplied risk. Whether it's precise, whether it's sort of as precise as that, I don't think we know yet. But there's definitely a higher risk. And by the way, that's something, if the Drug Policy Alliance were more honest, we could have a conversation that said, let's try to warn vulnerable populations about this. If you have a first-degree relative who's mentally ill, maybe you shouldn't use. If you're having strange thoughts, upon using, certainly if you wind up in the ER because of paranoia or auditory hallucinations or whatever, you shouldn't use. You shouldn't use this drug as a long-term treatment for your psychiatric conditions. You shouldn't be thinking that it's an anti-anxiety medicine you should use for 6 months on end. There are ways to warn that don't just say, don't ever use this. But the DPA and the other advocates, and certainly the for-profit companies, aren't going to have that conversation unless they're forced to. That's one thing that's become clear to me in the last 3 months.
Listen, please join me in thanking Alex Berenson for coming and talking about his book.
Well, thank you, Paul, for having me.
It's my pleasure. The Institute for Behavior and Health and Smart Approaches to Marijuana are full partners with Heritage on this event. I want to thank them for their contributions and their assistance as well. Please join me in giving them a hand as well. Gang, we are adjourned.
Great interview. That's very informative. A lot of good stuff there. Like I said, tell your children the truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence. Great book. Pick it up on eBay, Amazon, $5-6. Get it pre-owned. I've read it 3 times. It's a great book. It shows the propensity for the mainstream media to push not decriminalization of marijuana, but legalization of marijuana. I think that a populace that's numb and distracted is easily influenced. That just could be me talking. But I do appreciate you guys' patience. This is part 3 of 3, so make sure you check out the other 2 also. Like and subscribe, leave a comment at the very end. Please keep coming back. It works if you work it. Get the word out there about marijuana. It is addictive, it can be deadly, and it's being pushed about all over this country, all over the world, as being this miracle drug, and it's not. Thanks again, guys. I do appreciate it. God bless. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. Say a prayer for the prayerless. Let it begin with you. God bless, guys.